Okay, now I'm going to do the demo on how to start your large coil projects. I went over your options in class, and now here is how you get started on each one. The first one I'll show you is how to get started on the large coil pot like this. To begin, you're going to create your slab base here, and it's very, very simple. You just need a couple of tools. I'm not going to use the slab roller because I'm only going to need to flatten out a small piece of clay. I'm only taking a really small amount. I have slab guides here, which you can find in the back of the room in one of the cubbies. I'm choosing 2 sticks that are the same width, and this is going to determine how thick the base of my pot is. So choose one that's about 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 an inch thick. I have some really large ones back there, but that just means you're going to have a very heavy bottom to your pot. So choose one of the thinner sizes. Just make sure they match. I'm going to lay them down on my mat here, and the clay is going to be in the middle. The next thing you want is a rolling pin, and I'm just going to flatten this out a little bit and make sure that the rolling pin is wide enough to sit on your guides, because again, this is going to prevent you from making an uneven slab. You want the pin to roll on these evenly. You don't want it to like fall off or anything like that. So to roll the slab, you're just going to take the rolling pin, stick it on the clay, and then just roll back and forth until it doesn't get any thinner. And there you have a nice even slab base. So you don't need the slab guides in the roller anymore. This would be your base. You can use any sort of template to create a circle, a square. You can do a triangle. I would stay away from anything that has sharp angles, because as you build up from the bottom to the top, you are going to have to put your hand inside the pot to smooth the coils. And if you have very, very sharp angles on your base, it's going to be difficult to get your finger or a tool in there. Same thing, if it's too small and you can't fit your hand in, then you can't smooth the inside of your pot. So I'm just going to kind of go with an oval shape. It's not all that large. I'm just freehanding it. So now I have my base here. The first step is to attach a coil to the base. And like I mentioned, doing the warm-ups, because we rolled the slab for the bottom of this, and now we're going to have a coil attached to it, I need to score and slip that first level of coils down. And again, this is going to be the wall of your pot. So the thickness of the coil should be fairly thick, especially at the bottom, because at the bottom of your pot, it has to support all the weight as you build up. And if you have a very, very thin coil at the base, it's really not going to support anything that goes on top of it. So go a little bit thicker on the bottom. So I'm just going to start scoring around the bottom here. And I'm also going to score the coil. So I'm going to score this whole thing. I don't think I'll need the whole thing, but I'll go along the whole thing. So we'll take the slip and place it around the base. And then I'm going to place the coil and smush it down. Now I have a couple of options at this point. If I was going to do a planned out design and I wanted something very, very organized, then I might cut this coil here, do another coil, cut it, do another coil. But again, for demo purposes, I'm just going to kind of go with the flow. So I'm just going to take this coil and continue building up. So it's not, from the outside, it's not going to look completely even, because I'll have a little gap there. Now you want to give yourself a couple of inches, maybe 2 inches, 3 inches of designs before you start smoothing. It's just a little bit easier to build up and then smooth. And the one thing you can begin to do is work in sections. So if you wanted to create some sort of pattern. You can make multiples. I can take the spiral shape here. I can also begin to shape this into a triangle, and maybe you want to build with the triangle shape. Just start taking multiple pieces. And again, these are fairly thick because remember, I'm going to take part of the clay and smooth it together on the inside. So I want to make sure that there's enough thickness in the coil that I can get away with taking some of this space. I'll do one more so you can see how they'll fit together. I'm just tapping them. So they could kind of fit together like that. Now if I was really planned out, I could make a whole strip of them, smooth everything together, and then attach it all in one single piece, which I'll probably just do these 3 for the demo. So I'm smoothing the edges here. It's easier to smooth pieces together before they're attached also, especially ones that have sort of a complicated design, and you don't want to mess up the design once you put it on. So once I smoothed it, you can kind of see the triangle spirals here, and I would just place it on the top where I wanted it on my pot, and then continue to build. And I'll put one coil around here so you can see how I'll smooth it together. So I'll just continue and place it up and over. I can also double back. And maybe you want to go a little taller, I don't know. So there's kind of one side going. If I was actually making this, I would fill it in. This is a little bit unstable because it's heavy on one side. I would be doing the other side at the same time. But so you can see how I'm smoothing things. I'm going to leave it high on one side. Now all I'm going to do before I get too tall is go on the inside and smooth all of my coils down. So I'm taking a little bit of the coil from the top and smushing it down. So your wall of your pot will get thinner because you're taking some of that coil and smushing it into the previous one. So that's why you want to build things a little bit thicker than you think you need, because you will be thinning the coils down as you smooth. And for any areas that it's difficult to get into, again, use your wooden tool, and notice how I'm always bracing the outside with my hand here. And that's going to keep your coil pot in the shape that you want it and not have it distort. And then you would just continue building up. A couple of things to start to change the shape of the pot. It really just depends on the placement of the coil. For instance, if you had, I'm just going to roll a couple of coils here, if you wanted the pot to start to flare out, then instead of placing the coils directly on top of one another, so instead of having it go right on top where you would have a straight line up, you would begin to place the coil on the outer edge of the previous coil. So over time, over 3 or 4 coils, it'll begin to flare out. And the same thing with having something go back in is place the coil on the interior, not directly next to, but just on the inside of the previous coil. So over a few coils, you'll begin to see the coil pot curve back in. Okay? So that's how we can control the shape I will say when you start, don't go too wide or it's going to flop down. So give yourself a couple of gradual coils that go out and then back in. So that's the exposed coil demonstration. For the other option, so if you're using the coils to create a coil pot like this, for instance, where you cannot see how it was made, all of these roses were made individually and scored and slipped to the surface of the coil pot after it was put together. But the white part of this pot was all made from coils. But if you don't like the look of individual coils or you want just a nice smooth form, then you're going to smooth the outside of your pot as you go up instead of the inside. There's a couple of things that you want to keep in mind. It's really difficult to make something symmetrical, so it will be helpful if you have a shape in mind to create some sort of cardboard template. That way, as you build up, you can kind of put this template next to the bowl or next to whatever you're building and make sure, as you spin the bowl around, make sure your coil placements are following your template, and that will keep it fairly symmetrical. The main thing is actually starting these pots inside of a bowl. And I did the basic demonstration for the warm-up, but I made this one previously. The one thing you have to do, since you are smoothing the outside of your pot, once you reach the top of your mold, you do have to pop this out and smooth the outside of your piece. And I would suggest doing that before it stiffens up too much. So I made this previously, and you can see the coils that make up the pot, but I want it to be nice and smooth. So I'm going to take my wooden tool and I'm just going to go around and smooth these coils down. Your pot may change shape at this point because the clay is probably still a little soft. I made this a couple hours ago, so it has stiffened up a little bit, but it doesn't matter if it changes too drastically in shape because we're going to eventually put it back in the bowl and reshape it. So at this point, I just want the outside to be smooth so everything stays together. Okay, so you can't see my coils anymore, but this is kind of messy. There's some little crumble marks on it. It's not all that even. You can see all my little wooden tool marks. I'm not too worried about that at this point. Once the entire shape is finished, then I can take it out of the bowl and then really use either a spoon to paddle it into shape or one of the metal tools to really scrape down the side. So at this point, I'm not going to worry about what this outside looks like. I just needed to make sure that those coils were smooth together so they're less likely to crack, and it also is a lot easier to smooth those coils when the clay is still wet. Once it's dry, it is almost impossible to get that coil design out of the surface. So before I continue to build up in the pot, I need to reline this so I can reshape this bottom part. So I'll just use the newspaper that I had in there before, if it's not too soggy wet. If you need to put fresh newspaper in, that's no problem. But the most important thing is you want newspaper in there so you can actually get your pot out. So I'll just fill all that up. And I'm going to place this back in. Just drop it in and push it into the side to remold it. At this point, I'm going to just get rid of some of these newspaper things that are in the way. I want to make sure to leave the newspaper. I don't want to rip it out from where the clay is touching, but just I don't need it on the outside here. So once you build the bottom of your pot in the bowl, the more difficult part is when you start to build above. And that's what I'm just going to continue to do on the side here. And again, it's really important that you are creating thicker coils. One thing that people tend to do is really go thin without realizing it, because you're building within the bowl. It feels really sturdy. When you push against it, it's not really moving around. And then when you start building above the top of the bowl, it gets really unstable because you're used to rolling smaller coils. So go with something thicker. And then again, because it's coils, I'm just going to lay it on top. If I had let this sit for a while and it was very dry, and I'm attaching wet clay to it, I would want to score and slip it. Not because I think that they're two different methods of working with clay, but it is two drynesses. So wet clay is not really going to stick to drier clay without scoring and slipping. So we'll just start creating some coils here and build up above the pot. And because I'm just going to smooth the outside of this, I don't really care if these coils are uneven. I just want to build up the sides of my pot. So sometimes you can actually take a thicker coil, flatten it down, and get some height that way a little bit quicker. I'm just going to build up above the bowl. So you can see I'm building unsupported here, and this is where your template is going to come in handy. I've cut out this little notch because the bowl that I'm using as a mold here has a little lip to it. So you really want to make sure you're not building your pot on that lip, because when you take this out of the bowl, you're going to have a huge indent in the bottom part. So I've created a template that kind of takes care of making sure that my clay stays inside of that lip. So that notch in the template just fits on that lip there. And now what I would do is as I'm working, every couple of inches, I would take my template, put it up against the side of my pot, and just kind of push the coils so they follow what my template is here. And that is going to help keep this symmetrical. And same thing like the other option, build up a couple of inches and then begin to smooth down. And again, support the outside of your piece with your hand here, or use a tool to really smooth that together. Some things that tend to happen is that you begin to smooth out and it starts to flare out, and really that's just how you're placing your hand in when you're supporting and smoothing. So my hand is almost like it's covering it, so I can really push hard against it and keep it from pushing out. If I was pushing it unsupported, you can see how the clay begins to flare out naturally, and then over time it's just going to get wider and wider. So you really want to make sure that you're supporting the clay. And so I would just do this until I get the desired shape. And that's about it. So this method of using a bowl here is good for creating a nice form, and it's also good for this technique of scoring and slipping designs to the outside of it. One advantage of doing some sort of attached design or texture is that it can disguise any areas that you might not like, or if it's not perfectly symmetrical, if you've put some sort of banded design around the whole piece, it distracts your eye from something that might not be completely symmetrical. The last thing that you want to do once you kind of create your piece here is you have to smooth the outside. So I'm smoothing the inside as I go, and then I'm going to smooth the outside. Same thing, I'm supporting on the inside here. And the outside is a little bit easier when you have a little bit more height to it. But again, everything needs to be supported either by your hand or inside the bowl. And I'll do my final smoothings when I've created the entire piece. So once I get to the shape that I want, the last thing that you do is pop off the bowl. And this is really soft clay, but if you're doing it in class, over time it will stiffen up. And the last thing that you need to do is get rid of the seam between the coil at the top of the bowl and what you've built up above it. And sometimes you do need to, since it's stiffened up a little bit, you might need to score and slip a coil and cover up that seam, but that'll be the last step, is taking it out of the bowl. So the majority of construction of this method happens with the bottom of your piece supported inside the bowl. Okay. And that's it. The final option you have for using a mold, if you don't want something that's rounded in a more traditional looking coil pot, and you don't like kind of the rounded part of this, if you want to do something a little bit more geometric, like something like that, you can build within a cardboard mold. You can create your own mold using pieces of cardboard. I've got a whole bunch of different templates on pieces of paper that you can cut out or create your own template and then tape the mold together. And then you would just build with coils directly inside this mold instead of using a bowl. Because you're using cardboard, you also don't need to line this with newspaper because the cardboard is porous, and you can just lay your clay designs right on the interior of this. So this here it's a little bit smaller because this was a different mold, but you can kind of see how the coil is pushed against the mold and then popped out in the same way, and now you have a really geometric shape here. You can also make multiples and score and slip them together like we did the animals. You know, if I had two of these, one would be the base, and then one could be scored and slipped on the top. The same thing is true if you're using molds like this. You can create two bowl-shaped pieces, score and slip them together, and then you have something more rounded. So those are your other options of creating coil pots using molds.